So, now that we can get into the main bits of it, thank you everyone for coming to our first Pi People in person for 2 years, and our first attempt at doing it streamed and live at the same time. So fingers crossed it all goes to plan. So today we have some really, really interesting speakers, some of which I'm personally really excited to have in the room. So we'll be starting with Rachel Coldicutt, who used to run an organization called Doteveryone and now is a director at Careful Industries. I always get the two confused. And is an expert on looking at the social impact of new technologies and how we can be more considered about how they are used and the impact they have in the world. We'll also be hearing from J. Paul Neeley, who is an expert on futurism and design and helping clients think about the more long-term impact and the real considerations that they might have missed in their work. And Clive Griniyer, who heads, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the service design course at the Royal College of Art. So he has a few fans in the room, but yeah, he'll have some interesting things to say. So looking forward to that. So as a bit of an introduction, as last time we did Pi People in person, we weren't Frog. We were a company called Idean, and before that we were Adaptive Lab, but now we are all one bigger, more strong design entity. It means we get to lean into 6 decades of design and innovation across the last, well, long before I was born. Done some great work looking at working with different companies, different entities, but looking at how design has evolved over the years. So when Frog was first founded, it was very much looking at form follows emotion. So how do you design things that people can emotionally engage with and find interesting, not just things that are functional and practical and boring? Over the years, that's evolved, and particularly when we start moving into like the 2000s, looking beyond just digital, how can we transform organizations based on that? We'll then talk about convergent design and what that means, and then also a little bit about what we see in the future, going beyond that. We are a huge team now. So I think in London, we're about 200 people. We have studios all over the world. The design has definitely rolled out into lots of different places that you wouldn't have seen it just a few years ago. Like I have calls with people in the US, in the Far East, all over the place, which is really nice to see as they join the team and bring different perspectives to the work that we do. Now, why convergence? Why is that the topic that we wanted to talk about? So in Frog, we have a proposition, something that we talk about called convergent design. So you have your product designers, you have your service designers, you have your physical space designers. When we really want to start solving problems, you need to sort of bring those things together. So how do you break down those silos to bring together disciplines to work more effectively to solve better problems? So that's gone through a few different iterations over the years. So when you look at where it started with Apple, slight product placement for the work that we've done previously, but really bringing together the hardware and the software to bring together sort of more optimized experience. That's evolved. Digital has become a much bigger thing. So looking at how you can bring together digital and physical hardware to then make for more connected, engaging experiences. So really starting to look at the proliferation of cheap electronics, sensors, wearables, all that sort of equipment that we now use all the time. We all have phones, watches, things that are connected all the time. Now as we've progressed over the last few years and things have become more connected and more considered, you're starting to get these more connected ecosystems. So look at the smart cars, how do you use data between them, how do you make better informed decisions? And this really starts to build a service layer. So as a service designer, this is one of the big things. How do you then build things that work across all of these products and services? I've realized I should have opened with, hi, I'm Will. I am head of service design at Frog. Useful context when I say I'm a service designer. But then looking at what's coming next and a lot of the pressures and the problems we're trying to solve, it's not just about building products that sell well and services that people can use that make them feel nice, but being much more considered about the things that we design and the impact that that has on the world around us. So I've been thinking about what is the future of convergence and the role in design. I talk quite a lot about relationships. So rather than thinking about individual things that are connected to other things, you look at ecosystems, organizations, networks. It's a lot more complicated. You can't just focus on designing one thing and hoping that's right. When you're looking at networks of people or how people interact, you really need to start thinking beyond just the design of the thing, but what is the impact it has and how it relates to others. So looking at some of the skills and the disciplines we then start to reach into, we have things like ethical design, regenerative design, systems thinking, behavioral science, sociology, really leaning into those areas where I think design sometimes feels uncomfortable. Understanding that as designers, we don't know everything. Not everything is about a really nice customer journey or a really nice design for a product, but about understanding the wider context. And humanities have been doing a lot of work around like ethics and the impact and understanding what this really means. So we can't just think about as designers, what is it we do, but how do we work with other disciplines and bring that into the work we do? It's not just about product designers, service designers, and engineers, but people who have opinions and perspectives that are really important to making sure we have a better impact in the world. So when I talk about relationships and the things that we design, I've sort of distilled a lot of thinking down to one very simple slide. But when we're designing products or services or organizations, how does what we design relate to other things? So it could be, how does it connect to other objects? How does it connect to other people? But also, does it do things like, does it make something else obsolete? Are you just making something newer and shinier so that you can sell it when you're just making something else obsolete? Are there other things that you can consider? How does what we design relate to the world around us? What is its environmental impact? What's the economic impact? Particularly when you're looking at designing organizations and services or social networks. These can have a huge impact that if they're not considered properly, that can have a massive negative impact. So we need to be much more considered. And I think a really big area for me in service design and organizational design is, how does what we design impact how we relate to each other? If you're building services, organizations, social networks, platforms, there's always some sort of influence or control over that. So when you're designing these things, does it build stronger relationships? Does it change power structures? What is the impact that these things have on the world? We can't just design a social network or a system and spin it out and then worry about the impact later. Moving fast and breaking things is really nice when you're making a little shiny app. It's not great when you're changing an organization, when that can influence people's jobs and lives. They need to be much more considered. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. We've got some really insightful people in the room who can really add some color to this, because this is all some nice thinking that I've had, but I am by no means an expert, and hopefully some people can add a lot of color to this. Now, obviously, doing work like this requires a diverse range of skills, perspectives, and bringing that all together in convergent ways of working. And fundamentally, that is about understanding and being able to work with other people, with other perspectives. But this also leads very nicely to why this is called Pie People. We want to meet with pie-shaped people, is how we describe it. So we've all heard about T-shaped. Like, I'm sure you've all heard about T-shaped people with a depth of knowledge and a breadth of experience. But there's a limit to that. We like to hire people who have hybrids, who have a range of skill sets that understand across perspectives, but can also bring multiple things. We think that being like a specific just service designer or specific just product designer can be limiting. So we try to bring in people who have a range of expertise. This is a nice loop back to why we call it this after so many years. It's nice that it is still relevant. So that's why we're here and what we wanted to talk about. As an opportunity to just pick ourselves up. We do like to build this community. It's always great having people in the room and building out this network. We're always open to meeting new people who are interested in working with us and working on new projects. So follow us on Eventbrite for more events. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all the usual social network things. There's also a hashtag, which I think is PiePeople25. It should appear on the screen because we didn't put it on this slide in time. But feel free to share, comment. We like to see what's going on. people watching online, put comments, questions into the chat, and we'll try to capture those and make sure we raise those in the room as well. So, at that point, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Rachel Coldicutt, who is going to leave us much better informed than I feel right now on topics that are far too complicated for my brain sometimes. There you go.
Hello. Right, I've got lots of things I have to hold at once, so bear with me. So hi, right. I am not going to talk about design. I'm going to talk about thinking about what happens next and how to think about what happens next in ways that are complicated. I have been doing a piece of work over the last year and a half now, working with a number of people who work at charities, who are volunteers, who are really kind of doing the opposite of what I'm going to presume lots of us here do. They're kind of out in the world doing things hands-on. I'm working with them to understand how they would, how they're thinking about what the world is likely to be in 2036. And I've got a little jargon in here, and I realised I gave this talk, I was just saying last week, to a bunch of people who work in the military, which is quite a different audience. And they're all very into thinking about years and years ahead. And so maybe I will just carry on and we can pick up any terms anybody doesn't understand at the end. Anyway, this is me. I'm like a long-time internet person. I started working on the web in 1996 and have kind of, over the years, kind of moved into thinking about how to make technology better for everyone, having maybe slightly contributed to making it worse. And so lots of the things I do now are really about how to put communities at the heart of things, and so how to turn over the power that maybe we all have and the kinds of technologies we make, kind of how they kind of coalesce and bundle things up, kind of taking that apart again. So there's a URL at the end. I'll be talking about this work here. And I'm going to start by introducing a thought. So I don't know if anybody here has read the Ursula Le Guin essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. Anyone? No. Well, it's great and it's short, so it's highly recommended. And what it's about is it's really easy to think that progress in the world began because a man killed a thing and picked up a bone and hit thing with the bone. But actually, if there hadn't been somebody walking along afterwards with a carrier bag, gathering the food that people ate, taking it back, sharing it, looking after it, we'd have all been pretty hungry, right? And that can feel like maybe a more sort of boring way of talking about things. And I think particularly because the kind of stuff that everyone here makes can feel invisible, it can feel slightly abstract. We all want it to be exciting and heroic, but actually it doesn't have to be. So, I don't have loads of time, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the commons, but one of the reasons I think the commons is really important and interesting is, a lot of the time, a lot of the work that Will was showing up here, nobody gets to look at, right? There's a lot of things that happen in PowerPoints, in reports, in meetings, either in government or in business, that kind of stay there. And actually, they're informed by the opinions of a tiny number of people. And even when you're out there maybe doing research, the thing you're often doing is you're understanding what people think about your thing. You're not understanding how they're thinking about the world. And you're not understanding the kind of world they're interested in creating. So I'm not going to go into this, but I really recommend if it's not an area you're familiar with, just starting to think a little bit more about how the things that you're making and creating might have a value out of the normal forums that they are used and talked about. So, this is really what I'm here to talk about. So, the Zapatistas, who are amazing revolutionary community, have a slogan about making a world where many worlds fit. And the point of that is that there is never at any moment only one world. Everyone here is experiencing their own reality. And my families, the people aside, the people in other countries, right? That everything is, you know, there's a degree of things that are shared, but they're not as much as we think. And that actually, can we start to design and create opportunities by bringing in lots of different perspectives? So, I'm just going to carry on. A lot of the time, when, for instance, so I might be working with a client who might be, say, a government department or a large corporate, and the things that everybody thinks everyone is interested in are kind of over here, right? This is the kind of normal space. But really, when you start talking to people about what's happening and what's on their mind, it moves like all the way over here, right? And that actually our lives are made of like all of these things. But infrastructure tends to happen around a very tiny number of verticals, which don't really speak to the rest of our lives. And like, it's very easy when we think about or start talking about things that can happen and will happen, to kind of latch on to tropes, right? To be thinking about space, to be thinking about, like, this is a slide from the DARPA before site deck, where they're talking about mitigating technological surprise, right? A lot of the time, when people are trying to think about what's coming next, they're thinking about how to be in charge. They're thinking about how to send rockets. They're not thinking about how to hold and how to nurture and how to cultivate things. And so I'm going to power on to talk about, like, rather than, like, a lot of the time, when we do work in consulting, what we're trying to do is kind of get to the top here, right? We're trying to influence the most influential people to make the biggest change. But actually, there's something really interesting and different that happens here about what's going on in all of our minds, about kind of where we're heading and where we're moving. Ooh, that was a lot louder, sorry. So, right, I've got too many slides. Right, so I will kind of end with an example of the sorts of ideas that came up when we did this work. We spent probably, I think, in total last year, 3 months working with a group of 13 people, really hands-on, to craft a number of features. So this is one of them. And what they talked about together was a world in which it's like 2036. A lot of bad things have happened between then and now, but a few okay things as well. And one of the things that everyone was very hopeful about is that actually the amount of kind of change and trauma that we go through collectively leads to the launch of some kind of voluntary care corps, where everybody in the country is tasked with either welcoming migrants at the border or doing climate work, and that we are collectively and together looking after each other. But the problem is when this happens and looking after each other becomes the norm, what starts bubbling underneath it, right? What's the alternative? Well, like, what's the anarchic response? Because I think maybe now, in 2022, the anarchic response to what's happening is to look after each other, right? That's the thing that is going against the grain. But actually, maybe in 2036, we're looking at an undercurrent of decadence, of excitement, of rebellion after years of austerity, heat, misery, you know. And one of the things that was really interesting, just to sort of wrap up, like as we were doing this work, and to go like all the way back, I'm going to give everybody a headache now, just go really quickly through loads of slides, is that actually to remember that we hold all of these things at once. We're not only just thinking about health, we're thinking about everything. And we're thinking about how all of these things change each other, interrelate. And I think most importantly, in the context we're in now, how it's possible for everybody not to agree, right? And there's this very traditional binary narrative, I think, that's happening at the moment, which is that because for the first time ever we can hear nearly everyone, we're starting to put everyone on a binary of left and right, of right and wrong, culture wars. And that actually, they're only the loudest things we're able to hear. You know, the thing that's actually happening is everyone is here, everywhere, all at once. Right, I'm just going to go really quickly again, and I apologise if that is upsetting. I will just close with the thought that, is it possible in all of the work we're doing here to make worlds where many worlds fit, where many worlds are possible, to not just hang on to like the normative, the everyday, and to expand more and more and more? And I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll quickly ask, were there questions from online? No? Cool. We'll give it a couple of minutes. I had an interesting reflection when I was talking with a friend of mine recently about how the norm has changed and evolved. So if you look back to, I think the example they used was Cadbury's when it was first founded. There was a certain amount of sort of responsibility felt by the organization. They developed a whole host of places for people to live in and sort of support to the people who worked for them. Whereas now there seems to be much less of that sort of expectation on businesses. There's a, oh no, somebody on the remote. Yeah, now there's sort of less of an expectation. People are much more focused on their own business and their own profitability. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how that has evolved or what it might change into in future.
I mean, oh my gosh, I've got loads of thoughts on that. Like, mostly, though, as someone who spent a lot of the last 10 years kind of doing ethical business things. But at the moment, though, I would say, I think particularly post-COVID, so like pre-COVID, we were already sort of very individualised, I think, through technologies. And then, of course, we've been at home on our own, or maybe with like a couple of people for like a long time. And that actually, kind of generally, this idea that who is responsible, right, I think has really changed over the years. But what I would say, if you go back in time, like to when Cadbury started and when Clark's started, I think you're probably like maybe pre or alongside the welfare state. And, you know, there was an idea that there was a safety net. And I think we're going back now to the idea that there isn't a safety net, you know. And when I talk to people in North America about what maybe 5 years ago to me seemed very dystopian livelihoods, You can see those happening here now, where people are doing GoFundMes for healthcare, right? In the home of the NHS, which is absolutely crazy, right? So I think there's something. It's not about we used to have benevolent businesses. It's that maybe we used to have benevolent governments, and maybe that is not the case at the moment.
Having to fill the gaps a bit.
Yes.
Yeah. Are there any questions? Good. I just want to leave people feeling left out online. I'll ask to the room. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask?
Hi there. Hi there. Hello. Really enjoyed that. You mentioned that you worked with 13 groups or 13 individuals to create 13 visions of the future. Did you notice any patterns that you found interesting between utopian visions of futures and the the utopian visions? Were there anything that kept on coming up that left you hopeful and gave you some kind of hope in the collective?
So what I would actually say that we did, right, so what we tried to do through the Princess was to be neither utopian nor dystopian, and by gathering many perspectives to be pragmatic. And so to say, basically, there will very often be a good thing happening and a bad thing. Sometimes the bad thing might override the good thing, but it might just be a bad thing that's happening over here that allows the good thing to continue to be. Do you see what I mean? And so one of the papers that we wrote is called A Constellation of the Futures, right? And so I think it's much more that, and to go back to the quote that I had up, it's very easy to fixate on the negative, right? It's much harder to fixate on the positive, because very often the positive is like tiny acts, right? But, you know, I would say, to me, the idea that there was a collective agreement that we might be in a place where people were mobilized to welcome migrants at borders, right? That was just like an act of care and love that people did, for instance. Or we had another one that was thinking about intergenerational healing, and how, you know, particularly if we go forward to 2036, you might have younger generations who are feeling like we've fucked it all up. I mean, legitimately, I think. And that actually, how could you create a mechanism to acknowledge that, and to, like, rather than to just blithely say, oh yeah, that's happened, how could you institute both reparation and hope, you know? And so I think the things that came up are that actually, like, the infrastructures of hope need building, right? We can't just wait to get to 2036 and think, is everything okay now? What we need to be doing, and I suppose this is like a whole other thing I didn't get an opportunity to talk about. We did work that was sort of laddering back to say what has to happen now in order to make this happen in 2036. What has to happen to get us to a place that is hopeful? And the idea that actually, if you're working in a charity, if you're an activist, if you're a campaigner, you can have a long vision and be continuing to hold that while all the things that happen day to day carry on. So it's not utopian, but I think we have to look for hope wherever we can find it. I think we had another question, if it's not too much.
One very speedy question.
So in design, or when you think of, like, from the designer position, what do you think encourages this collective behavior or collectiveness, or encourages that? Like, how can we design for that?
I mean, I think one of the problems is maybe some of the systems and some of the approaches that we've normalized over the last 20 years are much more about meeting individual needs. They're not really about meeting collective needs. And I'll just kind of land with you something. So one of the other kind of random things I'm working on at the moment, they all kind of tie together, but they may not sound as if they do, is trying to roll out a free internet on a housing estate in South London. And what we realised is, what the problem is that the internet providers provide internet to a household. They don't have a model. They've never thought of having a model that is providing internet to groups of households, right? And just that tiny change to take you out of the house into the group, right? And I wonder if that might be the lever to not always put everybody in their household and to individualize them all the time.
Thanks. I think it's a really useful reflection for designers who often use personas and archetypes for everything. Thank you, Rachel. It's really interesting stuff. And yes, I definitely recommend reading the reports on their website. There's some really interesting stuff. So next, I remembered there is something I forgot. On your seats, there is a piece of paper with some boxes on. As a reflective exercise, we'd like you to sort of think about what are the sorts of gnarly problems you are seeing in the world and the sorts of people or disciplines you would like to work with to try and solve that, to try and understand what sorts of people should we work with or try to engage more so we can do better work. So as you think about it and you mix afterwards, we can stick them on the wall and then we can reflect on them later. So next, I'll hand over to Jay Paul to present.
Great, thank you, Will. So yeah, my name is Jay Paul Neeley, and I'm excited to talk to you tonight about future complexities and the possibilities of creating meaningful impact in sort of the complex reality that we exist within. So for about the past 10 years, I've had the opportunity to support the service design course at the Royal College of Art, teaching there in various capacities. I also teach speculative design to professional groups at the School of Critical Design, and I run my own design practice, Neeley Worldwide. And there I'm really fascinated about opportunities to create meaningful impact. And we do that in a number of ways, but have worked with projects like the world's first virtual hospital. I've worked with the UK government on focusing on shifting from treatment of homelessness to how we look at prevention of homelessness and catching early risk. I've worked with companies like Microsoft, the NHS, and Google X on emerging technologies and futures. But all of this just to say, I've had experience in complex systems like health and public services and looking at impacts of emerging technologies. And I've actually come to the belief that our current design and business practices will destroy everything we know. And we're in the midst of this kind of destruction. And I think that because there's a fundamental mismatch between the way in which we go about our design practice and the complex reality that we exist within. So think about how we design, right? We narrow down the scope of the problem that we have until it's something that we can understand and wrap our minds around, and we align it with the business goals and we align it with the resources and time that we have, and then we solve for that problem. And we create a solution and we celebrate that solution and we scale it and we win design awards for it. And then we put it into a world where it doesn't respect any of the interconnections, where nothing exists in isolation and everything is interconnected. And this mismatch here causes all sorts of, even with good intentions, causes all sorts of disruption, negative externalities to the system. And it's not only that individual optimization of a part that's problematic, actually the cumulative effect of all of our optimizations of parts is actually catastrophic to the whole system. So every good intended project without considering sort of that larger system is incredibly problematic. But you can think about global financial instability, the obesity epidemic in the West, climate change, any of these big issues, you can look at them through this lens of the cumulative impact of the optimization of parts. And it's bothered me so much over the last sort of 15 years and sort of struggling with it. I've tried to work on some ideas around a new kind of design or a different way that we approach our work to sort of operate within this complex reality in a more meaningful way. And I won't go through all of the principles of this approach, but the general idea is that there are acknowledgments we have to make about the complex reality that we exist within that we very often don't as a starting point for our design practice and work that we're doing. And I'll just mention one here, 3, that sort of relates to Rachel's comments, that good is good and bad is bad and good, and often we can't tell the difference. Every value judgment is completely dependent on our view or location within the complex space, and is therefore quite arbitrary unless we have lots of different perspectives and understanding on where that's coming from. But tonight what I want to do is talk about 4 practices, and these are among a lot of different practices that I'm sort of gathering from different places or developing through my own practice to try to understand how we operate in this space. So I want to talk about considering everything, universal responsibility, grand priorities, and ideas around speculative design. So I'd suggest that we have to consider everything in our design of anything, and that anytime we consider less than that, we're missing critical information. And if you think about this evolution that design practice has had, we've moved beyond product into these service spaces and realized choreography of multiple interactions over time creates new kinds of value. And there's huge amounts of talk about systems and going beyond that. And I'd suggest that the value comes from this expansion of our purview, and that it should continue. That actually systems design isn't enough. There's actually one system. There is everything, and that's what we have to consider in any of our interactions. And I'll just share, I love some of the graphs or charts that were shared earlier about mapping ecosystems and spaces. I love this project from a few years ago, The Anatomy of an AI System. And so just looking at an Amazon Echo in the home, what are all of the systems behind the scenes that are involved in its production, its development, its operation? And you zoom in and you're looking at infrastructure of AWS and text-to-speech and skills and third parties, the human operator, the domestic infrastructure. You're looking at data models and how this information is held. You're looking at the physical raw materials, how they're disposed of, recycled, and the long-term geological processes and implications of those. The project won a design award here in the UK a few years ago, Design of the Year award, actually. And I think that's fabulous, but I think it's also tragic, because I think this should be our baseline for every project that we're doing. If you don't have this understanding of the space that you're operating in, you're prone to the same types of errors that have contributed to the types of problems we're dealing with today. And so this needs to be the starting point for our work. Once we begin to consider everything, then we have a new responsibility to that space. And I'd suggest we have to take a universal responsibility. So we're not just responsible for the immediate impacts of the designs that we create. We're actually responsible for all of the impacts of that design, no matter how many degrees of separation from the thing that we've created. And that really changes a lot of the decisions that we start to make. And I'll just give one quick example. We worked on a project a few years ago called Night Night Everyone. And we were curious about sleep deprivation and sleep debt. In the United States, there are some parts of the country where 30% of the adults are sleep deprived. In some parts, it's as high as 50%. Contributes to heart disease, obesity, diabetes, early death, decreased productivity in school and performance in school and work, motor vehicle accidents. I mean, it's really, really a significant problem. So we were thinking about this, and a lot of web design and interactions, I'm actually designing something that will take advantage of your attention for one of my goals. So we've built a website that's trying to look at a conversation about work that we're interested in doing with you. And there's a moment, though, however, that dynamic needs to change. So Night Night Everyone was then a little line of code and some JavaScript that goes onto a website, and it has a sleep and a wake time. And so as you spend time on our website, at a certain point, it goes to bed. And it says, it's late, nothing we can offer you is more important than your sleep. Sleep well, sweet dreams, and we'll catch you in the morning. But we're acknowledging that moment. If I take universal responsibility for the interaction, there's a moment at which your health and well-being and your sleep is more important than any value I can provide to you. And if I'm responsible for that, then I shift the way I interact, and I say, I'm sorry, I will help you later, but please, take care of yourself, sleep. I know there are edge cases to this and other things to think about. What's been interesting is the reactions fall largely into two camps. But I think one of the spaces which becomes really interesting is when we start to take this universal responsibility and something becomes quite beautiful. It starts to point to these types of collectives and communities and different ways of understanding our responsibilities to each other. The next idea is grand priorities. So once you're considering everything, suddenly the problem set really starts to change. And a sort of set of grand priorities or grand issues begins to emerge. And I'll just share one example. For the past 4 years, in every client presentation I give, every deck I send out, every talk I give, I include this slide. That whatever you're doing right now is probably not as important as addressing global warming. And it doesn't matter what topic we're working on, healthcare, homelessness, consumer electronics, AI, we include this conversation because it reframes whatever work is going on within that larger complex reality that we live within. And again, I'm a fan of little snippets of code. So we dropped in, a JavaScript that we've now put a sort of warming globe on every website that we run or operate. But again, all of our activities exist within this type of context. And I would suggest that any situation where you're not talking about climate change or any piece of work that isn't somehow understood within this context is incredibly problematic. And I think a majority of the work that happens in design, if you don't feel it now, will be seen in the next 5 or 10 years to just be horrifically tragic that we spent resources and efforts in these spaces. So these types of grand priorities, I think, are incredibly exciting. And again, they shift what we think is important and where we want to spend our energies. So the last idea I'll share with you is speculative design. And you may have felt this pressure as I shared this earlier. Sorry, speculative design, again, is the design of products and services, future products and services that give us a way to understand the implications of emerging technology or social and cultural shift. And I think it's part of considering everything. Again, you may have felt the pressure here that you haven't considered the future of the past. And I think that's a critical part of everything. We have to make decisions that optimize the system now, but we have to balance those with decisions that optimize the system for those that will inhabit the future, our future selves and others that will be there. And so speculative design becomes a mechanism that lets us spend time in the future and better understand future possibilities. So generally, we design lots of different futures, different distances into the future, different degrees of possibility as a way of having conversations about what is preferable and where we want to go. And just another example of that, we worked with Mercedes-Benz and Movil Lab, one of their research groups, a few years ago, and created a little children's book called Where Do Cars Go at Night? And the car drops off the boy at home after school, and the boy turns to the car and says, where do you go at night? And the car then elaborates on all of the different activities from cleaning the streets to delivering groceries to charging stations and repair and car sharing and infrastructure changes. And what was interesting is Mercedes-Benz was expert on the self-driving car and that ecosystem and what would happen in that experience. But there hadn't been a lot of conversation about the implications of that to the cityscape and other services. And so a simple sort of artifact from the future to help shift that discussion. And this, again, won a German design award for its sort of impact in that conversation. So what does this all mean? Again, I think there's a fundamental mismatch between the way we typically go about design and our complex reality. And we are taught to simplify, to abstract, to narrow scope to something that we can solve for. And that is completely false to the reality of the complex space we work within. So I think as we begin to consider everything, we start to take universal responsibility. We start to look at these grand priorities and spend more time in spaces like the future, I think we have a really interesting way to begin to develop opportunities for meaningful impact in the space we're working in. And I think that's the first chance that we'll have to begin to address some of these bigger issues that were facing us, when we acknowledge that many of them come from the very way in which we go about design today. So, yeah, thank you very much, and yeah, excited to continue the conversation.
Thanks. I will say it's always very nice when I put together my slides, then people send their presentations in, and you start seeing things that are consistent across. It's very rewarding. It means you don't have to rethink all of your slides. I have two sort of quick reflections. One personally on the sleep and prioritizing that. One of the things that I've carried for a long time, and I will always be glad of the person who told me this, as a service designer, there's never a service design emergency. You did your journeys, you did your personas, you create all that. If your website is down, if your car is broken down, you don't need to call me at 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night to try and get me to fix it. Priorities.
Yeah.
And then I think it was interesting reflecting on the prioritization and that like, everything is increasingly a sustainability problem. I think a lot of the work that we've done previously was trying to build like offers around sustainability. But clients don't ask for that a lot of the time. They have specific things they want to solve. So then we move towards how do we bring sustainability and regenerative design into all of our work so that it's done inevitably, not just because people asked about it. So a question I have is, when people approach you with some things that are quite specific and you want to sort of expand that and get them to think about other things, what are some of the things you do?
Yeah, so I think it is critical. Just to point on how everything is a sustainability issue, is a climate change issue. We've now missed 1.5 degrees. I need to update our code. We're headed towards 2, possibly even more. And I think at the height of the pandemic, we lowered emissions by 6% globally. And to actually meet the IPCC goals, we need 18% reductions year on year going forward. And so if we take that seriously, that's a complete reimagining of everything. There's nothing that you're working on now that isn't somehow affected by that. So I think one of the things we do is we include that slide in every deck. As there's nothing that we have a conversation about that doesn't exist within that context. And if we can't have that conversation with the client about how that is connected or what this means, then it makes it really uncomfortable, and I think they begin to feel it as well. So I think we should be turning down work. I think we should be, looking at reparations. I think we should be looking at some really serious and sort of radical ways of engaging with clients around this stuff. Because it's right, it's not the normal way that we do things. Design sort of operates as slave to this industry and that set of values, and that's the issue. So, yeah.
I'll ask, no online questions. In which case, I'll let you take a seat and we'll save some questions in the room for the panel.
Thank you.
Don't want to run out too soon. Thanks. So then, as our final speaker to wrap up, I will hand over to Clive to find out if we are at a party.
Let's have a party. Thank you. Wow, lovely to see lots of familiar faces. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah, it's better. Yeah. And wonderful. Thank you for the invite. Having two speakers go first is always really nerve-wracking because you think, what am I going to say after that? And I very nearly put the AI, anatomy of an AI slide in my deck as well. It's a brilliant slide. Thank you. But I'm in a very, very privileged position. My name's Clive. I'm the head of the service design course at the RCA. I'm now in the demand side. Sorry, I'm in the supply side. What do I mean? But I need to create demand, but I'm supplying the next generation of designers. I'm very optimistic about design. I think design's really important, and I'll try and explain why. But I think a lot of the issues we've already covered are absolutely vital. And the question I want to ask us all is, what is that convergence of people, design, systems, ethics, and politics? Are we even at Partygate. I wish we were. Maybe not that party. But what do we do, and what is the context in the entire world, and what are we really able to do about that? I am very optimistic, and I'm surrounded by people who love service design. They love my students, luckily, and it's a fascinating, wonderfully optimistic area to be in. However, the reason I get up every morning is that realization that I'm in a very tiny bubble, and that for most people and for most situations, services specifically are not designed at all. They're completely accidentally designed, and therefore they don't work. £36 billion, I believe, was spent on world-class track and trace. Do you remember that political slogan? It was not world-class. Nobody knew how to receive that information. The people delivering the service were left abandoned for weeks and months. About halfway through this huge, chaotic, massively expensive failure, they realized they might need some design of this service, and suddenly they were recruiting every service designer they could get their hand on. But how could we fail so massively in such a moment of importance? Why was the decision made to recruit a political friend and spend a lot of money on technology and deliver something that didn't work for anybody for many, many months? That killed people, that failure. So most of the services are not designed, they don't work. I live in a wonderful bubble where we try and do our work well, but they don't. And, the Ukrainian refugee process service, who thought of that? Who designed that? Who said it's okay to go on social media and find somebody from Ukraine to bring them into your home? I mean, what a recipe for disaster, and an absolute failure. So we are all kidding ourselves. Our work is not influential in any way in the big decisions that are made in the world that affect a lot of people. So why is that? And it turns out, as we've gone through this glorious journey of service design, we're 10 years old this year at the RCA, and I might think in my own memory that service design is about 20, I think LiveWork started 22 years ago, something like that. And these guys were designers. They came up with a wonderful service, Airbnb, brilliant, capturing people's unused space in their home, giving them a new business model. And here's the good people of Barcelona rioting because the heart has been ripped out of that beautiful city. It is now just the clack of luggage on cobbled every Sunday morning when they leave, or Saturday when they arrive, whatever it is. It's causing riots, this service. And let's not even go down the Uber route or other services that 10 years ago we thought were going to save mankind. And wonderful experiences for users, but not such great experiences for drivers and perhaps even passengers. So, at the same time, we live in a world that fundamentally believes, that is definitely not slide number 85, is it? I don't know what happened there. At the same time, we live in a world where technology is just handed the keys and all the budget. And it just solves problems we don't even have. I love my rogues gallery of useless technology that hopefully eventually disappears. But the intellectual effort to create this machine, this Segway, that had computerized gyroscopic motors so you didn't fall on your face. For what reason? Eventually it ended up with a few sad tourists in Florence or on golf courses, about 15 years after it was invented, completely useless. Oh, bugger, the bill's gone wrong. Never mind. That is the beginning and end of Google Glasses. The order has somewhat changed in the PowerPoint. But, who thought it was a good idea to just launch Google Glasses so that, people can see me wherever I am and in any social environment? That was a social crime, inventing Google Glasses. Maybe it's great if you're a nuclear power station running person or a brain surgeon. Maybe there are great applications, but they don't decide that. They throw it at us and hope that we're somehow going to make it work. What an incredibly stupid, risky way of developing technology. My wife will not have this in the house because she fears it's listening to us. And when we know that Amazon are developing a system to detect domestic abuse, it is listening to us. It really is. And then, WTF? What is this? I don't know. Should we just throw billions and billions in the next 10 years developing something we have that might have some benefits? The effing metaverse, come on. What is it? What do we need it for? Maybe you love the metaverse. Argue with me, by all means. But I just don't know why we're doing it. Because Facebook want to change their brand? I don't know. And this is a distressing photograph, and I apologize for that, but I don't apologize for it because there are new challenges. The bias of AI, deciding that Vernon is a lower risk than Brescia. Why do you think they're deciding that? Because of racial bias in AI. This is a really horrible thing that is sending people in America and increasingly in Britain to jail because of their historical legacy. Of where they live or the colour of their skin. I love this from the British Medical Journal. It's just been come out talking about how data and design and use and world is creating real problems, exacerbating inequality in healthcare. And that's shameful, isn't it? And design is there, you know. So whoever's doing it, it's hopefully not us, but it might be. But the act of design is causing damage. There's a theme tonight, isn't there? I thought I was okay because I was a service designer. I started life as a product designer. Oh, I'm not going to design products anymore. That'll, you know, think of all that landfill and all that stuff in the ocean. I'll be a service designer instead. Oh, hang on a minute. Where's all that data going? Where's all that platform, the emerging data waste problem we have? The huge numbers of having to be called data farms around the world. I mean, it is incredible that, you know, every second, every human being creates 1.7 megabytes. Bloody hell. Where is that and why? So there are some really massive challenges here. Now, I'm optimistic about design. I think we can make things better, if only because who else is going to make it better? Who else is going to try and think of everything? Who else is going to talk to a really broad number of people? I would say we are more likely to, and that's certainly what we teach students to do. So how do we intervene? Well, when I joined the RCA, I asked the staff and students to talk about what the ethos of the course was. And they came up with these words that we then turned into a set of sort of weird hieroglyphs that I can never comprehend unless the word's above them. But I think they're really important, and I hope they resonate with you, that we have to be much more curious, insanely curious than any normal person would be, let's say somebody in government. We have to have the courage to tell people what the truth is and say, look, we've got to do something different. But then we have that spirit of collaboration to collectively go forward. And then you do get innovation. Innovation has value. We have to do this. I much prefer plurality to diversity, to be honest. We build in the plurality of mindset and people and approach. And of course we want an inclusive. We think holistically. As J. Paul said, we've got to think incredibly holistically to solve even the smallest project. There is a dynamism in terms of reacting to the world. I think we do react, we should do. We definitely transform. I mean, we are not here to leave it as it is, unless there's good purpose for it to stay as it is. We're definitely people-focused, and I'm not ashamed of that. People say we have to be planet-focused. Well, I've got planet there too, because that's the biggest system. But people make decisions, and they make really poor decisions often. So we have to work with people to help them make better decisions and have a sense of purpose in what we do. So I think those behaviours are the things. It's not about blueprints. It's not about journey maps. It's about bringing a behaviour in my optimistic stance that I take. And we've had this 20th century framework where we say, well, we have to make sure we can make it, and we have to make sure we can afford it, and oh yeah, we have to make sure it's desirable. And we always say businesses are really good at these too, and we're really good at that, and students are absolutely terrible at this, even the ones in the room. And you know, we've always talked about creating that sort of balanced view of the world, but I'm now saying we used to be there. But what's fascinating to me is that organizations of every size and scale, commercial, political, whatever, who are coming to us now and saying, if we're going to use technology, we have to understand the ethics of technology. We must have new business models to make any of this circular regenerative economy work. and we've got to have new motivations. People do call themselves purpose-led businesses now. They do drop the profit motive from behind what they do, but they have to sustain themselves in the current system we work in. And we have to have a human and community benefit, beneficial to all, desirable social impact. And we need to be here. And I think that's certainly my mission, our mission at the RCA, is to understand that new territory and develop it as much as we can. And we do that. We envision possible futures. You know, this wasn't a brief. This was a discovery process. It is working with a big transactional organization, a real transactional organization, Visa. But this is a receipt of the 21st century from 12 months ago, graduating students. They said, here's the cost of your fashion garment, but it's the real cost. It's the material, the origin, it's the manufacturing, it's the transportation. How far did this come? It's the CO2 footprint, of course. It's the brand. What are their brand values? What does it mean for people, planet, and animals? What is it? Where are the materials? Where's everything about? What is the real cost of that garment? So that you, the consumer, can see that. But of course, this is only the iceberg of a massive system. This is not a receipt. It's a system that says you've got to give us this information. We've got to have the provenance, the authenticity of provenance to understand that and transfer that to the consumer. And if you don't do it, and that receipt shows all that empty, then you are shamed. You are incentivized through emotion to buy into this system so that we can make better choices and be better educated. And I think that's an optimistic, brilliant, that acknowledgement and empowerment and sharing shows a possible future. And the digital ethics question, you know, you're a startup, you're worried, all you can think about is your brilliant idea and how to get your next level of funding. The last thing you think about is ethics. So you make an ice cream van and put, well, I'll admit to you, it's actually face ethics. But I'm hoping you thought it was a ruder word than that. And because you want to jolt people out of their complacency and their mega, we're a startup, we're amazing, we're going to disrupt and everything that you said, Will. But actually, then it turns out that those startups get better funding opportunities because they're showing the responsibility about what they're doing. They're actually gaining to their business because they're stopping for a moment and trying to consider at least the ethical impact of what they do earlier than they normally would. And this has been hugely successful, even as a project. Oh, I should have said, then the artifact, a physical artifact saying what would Trump do with your product. You know, we're creating assets that intervene somehow. And I think that is the future. This is a project from this year's graduation show, which was called Reset. And this, I could have shown lots of projects, and apologies to the students in the room, I didn't show your projects. But this was a student who worked in a football team in the US, actually, and saw the incredible amount of product that was given to that team, the football boots, for every single football team is probably 16 teams by the time you get to the under-19s and the male and female and everything else. Vast, vast quantities, all of which is just thrown away at the end of it. So she went on a personal mission to convince that football club to reboot, as she put it, a reset project. And it's not just an app. The app is just a touch point to a system that she had to design to really make sure. And then she showed it to the Premiership, and then she showed it to FIFA. And FIFA are all over this. They realise they have to do it. And I suppose we're getting close to my point about convergence with politics now. We have to create visions that convince people, in fact, give them no alternative, but do things better. And yet, we live in a world where our government has decided that the value of art and design education is very low. We need more science, technology, engineering, and therefore we cut that education. And they do that because the Treasury has everybody's salaries. You know, they think that they should only be educating people to end up working in Canary Wharf. They do. And all the poor design graduates, though I think your wages are probably going up with the demand for service design at the moment, but they rarely get above that. And so they measure that, and then they said, oh, the whole creative, even if you measure the whole creative industries, that does not represent, I don't think, even 1% of the impact of design on the world, good or bad, but certainly economically. You know, how many little tiny companies with a little tiny designer have survived COVID by suddenly, finally thinking about design and doing it better? So we've got to measure the impact of what we do, as well as the negative impact in a positive sense. And we've got to stop that. And here's a politician. My students will know who this is. This is Lord John Bird, a crossbencher in the House of Lords. And we got a politician. We got him to the RCA in January for our Work in Progress show. And he's famous for being the founder of The Big Issue. I mean, he's an ex-con, an ex-drug addict, and he's now waltzing around the Lords, pontificating and opining very entertainingly. And he came to us. He didn't know why he was coming to the RCA. We just got a mate to bring him along. And it slowly dawned on him as he saw the work of the students. It dawned on him that he had been talking about reinventing thinking, because he knew that politicians were making bad decisions. They weren't thinking correctly. They weren't thinking to the extreme. They weren't understanding the scenarios, and they had no creative processes. And he was so taken with what he saw that he said, he's been trying to reinvent thinking, but I'm wrong. We need to redesign thinking. And I think that's the essence of what we can offer as what are we? A discipline, a bunch of people, a set of behaviors. I think we have to help redesign thinking to make better decisions. But the problem is, we're just not there yet. What we need to do is we need to raise the ambition of those we work with and for, and redesign thinking to help them and us contribute to making better solutions to the challenges ahead. And that's what we must do. I think the one thing design does is it raises ambition. It stops people just responding to the competition or looking at the world and thinking we're tinker with it a bit and maybe we're optimize and cut cost, not reflecting the damage we're doing. We've got to raise our ambition to save the world, exactly as our previous speakers have been talking about. But we're not even invited to the party. You know, we are sitting here waiting for the brief. You know, why aren't we out there saying this loud? Why aren't we bothering our politicians? Why aren't Frog Design fighting the government for cutting funding in arts education and design education? Why are we not saying to our clients, though clearly we are in some cases, but we need to take responsibility. We have a much more powerful position, I think, than perhaps we even know. But we need to get invited to the party. She did it. All of us can do it. And I really challenge us all to say it's not good enough to wait for the brief. It's not good enough to wait for the client. We have to drive forward and actually start changing the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Clive. I'll probably save questions for the panel, which we'll start in a second. But one thing I just want to reflect on was, I know we've had some talks this evening that are very much like, oh, design is terrible. Design is the worst thing ever, or we're destroying the planet. But it's also nice to see the optimism. Like, the reason that we do events like this is because we think we can do better. It's not that we are inherently flawed, but we need the tools and the drive to actually go out and do things and make them better. If I could get some help from one of my team, I can move these 4 chairs in. Okay. That's fine. You can stand. Would anyone else like stand, sit, or we can just do the panel? Amazing. Easy. We can save chairs. Before I go off my list of questions, have there been any raised online? Cool.
So, first question from Juliana to Jake Paul, but to everyone. How do you help companies to make decisions also based on the planet instead of only consumer needs? He said he finds it difficult to convince clients to make a meaningful change if consumers or citizens don't show a big desire for change.
Yeah, I think this is it's a really tricky one. It's when you're talking to someone whose entire, the business case, their compensation, their promotion and their job track and everything they're doing is maybe tied up in a particular perspective. It is really tough. I think the first thing is just to have the conversation. I've seen some interesting work, for example, happen at SAP over the last 5 years. And initially, the client engagement was with an individual who was head of a group on emerging technologies and AI. And the engagement started, we just said, hey, this is really interesting, but we think the problem is the climate. We think this is a much bigger issue. And it's been interesting to watch his personal journey within the organization now. He now is head of their sustainability group, offering services within SAP to all of their clients, and they've got some really interesting products that they're working on in this space. But I think it was just pointing out and having that conversation initially that opens that up. The other thing I'd say is working close to power. A lot of times we're operating at levels within an organization where people don't have the power to have those calls. So like Clive said, you actually have to be at the party. So who can pull the strings? Who can you convince that can actually make those changes in direction for an organization? Those are a few thoughts, but it is a tricky one.
I mean, I'd add that sometimes the reason people bring you in is to say the things they're not allowed to say. And sometimes it goes down really terribly, and you have to look at that as a lost revenue opportunity. But as an ethical practitioner, good thing to do, right? To not always take the cash, to sometimes say, well, actually, this work needs to do this. I mean, we've just wrapped on a piece of work with some people who asked us to help them be more ethical, but not that hard. And like, it doesn't really work. But actually, if you give them, and what you can do, I think, when you work with a client, is you can give them a gift. You can give them a post-it note. You can give them like a line, a slide, something. They may not be courageous enough to use it today or tomorrow, but they'll have it, and it will needle them, and then they will come back to it. And I think that is the job. And if that can't be the job, then you should do a different one, I would say.
I really like the idea of a client asking for the quick wins of ethics.
Always, always.
So I think it's a brilliant question, and I always thought it was really difficult. And maybe it's, if you hang around long enough, then people kind of treat you with a bit more reverence, and I've definitely hung around a long time. But I went to a big company in Germany 2 weeks ago because they wanted me to look at their user experience framework. After 6 hours, I walked out with 2 other people who'd been asked to do that as well. And we had told their executives to completely redesign their business model, completely redesign their company, and they were jumping around on chairs, loving it. I think what Rachel just said is absolutely right. They need to think differently, and they do understand that they need to think differently now. For most of my life, things like sustainability, people have said, we'll only do it when consumers ask for it. Well, they are asking for it, and they're politically asking for it, not just with their wallet. And things are changing fast, and companies are really trying to understand that changing population, the change of society. You can go in there and challenge them. You absolutely can, and you must. And if you're not senior enough to do that because you're not at the party, get your bosses to. Honestly, give Will a hard time. Will give his bosses a hard time. We have to tell people this, and we can design. We can be part of that solution then.
Can I just add, in my old job, one of the things we did is we made a toolkit for people on the product team to be subversive. So that actually, if people weren't asking you, you could build it into you could build that into the product, and then they wouldn't know what they were agreeing to, right? And so, I suppose it doesn't always need to be the people who are important. The people who are important, sometimes you need to sneak around the back. And that otherwise, life is very long. Your journey to be the important person, just to build on your comment, like, as a person who has done a lot of government work, it's exhausting and it's terrible, and there need to be hundreds of you. There need to be people like lining up behind you, and so I think it's like, give those people all the tools, the important people, and then be doing it too. Like, don't just leave it to them. It's like, and I know this is not what I'm supposed to be doing, but I thought, you know, in your circle, like in your Venn, we could equally try to be the whole of the circle, not just the middle. You know, like own the whole thing.
I love that. Well, I was in the middle, but I could be on the outside as well. But I think the big point is it's actually easier than you think. And anybody in service design especially has to understand politics. When someone offered me a job once and said it was 60% politics, I said, you're kidding. Nothing I've had is less than 95% politics. And it is, because you have to persuade people, and we talk about that a lot at the RCA. But I love your idea of the toolkit. You come and teach us the toolkit, please. Yeah.
I think one of the things to add on when you work with organizations in particular and helping them be aware of what they need to consider, organizations have a lot of things that are just established and they've been there for years, decades. That's just how they function. That's how financial decisions are made. That's how we structure. That's how we organize. Sometimes unless you raise the point, they won't even be aware of it. So it's not even sometimes that they're resistant, they're just completely unaware. So being able to make that point and push them in new directions can be really helpful. Serge? Yeah, I'll ask the room. Does anybody have a question for the panel?
Well, in terms of politics, I find it very hard to convince people that are not in my like-minded group. And how do you, especially intervene, or like how do you start a discussion? I find it very hard to even start a conversation or bring people even to think that way. And sometimes I feel like the mass doesn't think that way. And that really frustrates me. And I have to be very loud and like keep on repeating and try and explain different ways to make them understand. But I find that the biggest challenge, and I wonder what is your approach, what is your method about that, if you have?
It's a big question.
I mean, I'll just say I do love this idea of often you're the person, if you're in a consulting position, you're the person that can say things that can't be said. Yeah, I don't know. I think it is just starting the conversation. And it is hard. I mean, it takes time. But I think once these things are raised, they begin, it begins, something happens and movement will continue. So I don't know. I think it's... it's a start the conversation and maybe stay with it until something goes on, and then make sure the right people are there to listen.
I don't know, I'm just trying to think what's helpful, but I think a lot of people in business right now want to know what younger people think, for example. You are representing something that they don't understand at all. I think it's one of the reasons service design is probably expanding so fast. It's a young bunch of practitioners who have tools, but they understand the people they're designing for and the different values and the different purposes in that audience. So that makes you kind of special just by being young, which is interesting. But I do think it's something that you just have to, it's a skill you have to learn. No designer, certainly not a service designer, can actually truly expect to walk into a room and have somebody know what the hell they do. We have to be evangelists all the time anyway. So it's something we have to get good at. But I think using our skills to feed that appetite to hear something different. Don't underestimate it. Be confident. I know not everybody is, but...
I would maybe take us back to actually some of the things that you presented that kind of touch on some of the things that I presented, which is that it's like there's no one way, right? Life is made up continuously of all the ways at once, right? And somebody may be cruel when you want them to be kind. You can't do anything about that, right? You can't make them more nice, right? That's not how life works. So I think that actually there are two things. What you can do is you can build your coalition of the willing, right? Because they're the people who look after you. Because when you're constantly, like I spent 5 years doing government policy work, where I was always the person who was asked to be the interesting opposite person. Right, it's like exhausting. And what you need to do that is you need people to look after you. You need like a trampoline to bounce off, right? You can't be doing it alone. But I think actually it's not about, and I think, I tried to speak to this a little bit. It might feel like we are artificially polarised, right? But if you think about some of the maps that we looked at, actually maybe the power of being the designer is to express to people how everything is connected, right? It's not that they're wrong. People hate to be wrong, right? Like, when if you think of, if you have cats, right? If a cat jumps off a wall and falls over, it looks like really ashamed. And that's how nearly everybody is when they realise they're wrong. They're not going to tell you in the room, right? But, how can you get them to understand how everything is connected? How can you, what can you give them to take away? Because it might not be there and then. It might be later on. And I guess, it's not all your hard work alone. It's all of ours together.
One more just really quick thought on this is I think one of the opportunities with design is we can build stuff and we don't have to tell people and we don't have to get them on board. And so I love the subversive toolkit. A lot of times with speculative designs, we build those futures, and so we don't have to connect. We don't have to explain that it's a possibility. We don't even have to know what it is. It's real. Yeah, they can experience it. It can build some kind of empathy for that possibility, and that then changes the discussion. So maybe don't wait for permission to work in that space. Yeah, secretly slide in some of those concepts and make things tangible, and that advances the conversation really quickly. People that weren't listening before suddenly are having discussions about it.
That's our magic trick, isn't it?
Cool. Serge, there was another question line?
Yeah, so Tree asks, or says, thanks. They agree with the importance of considering everything, trying to consider the planet, all the systems that are interconnected, but they already have a challenge of getting clients to invest in research. So how do you tackle the issue? What tactical suggestions, advice, tips have you got to get clients to actually invest in research, especially such far-reaching research?
I mean, just a quick thought. I found this with service design when I started. Nobody knew what service design. This was in the States in 2004, and I was watching Live Work here. Nobody knew what service design was in the States, and the jobs were for marketing, but so we would say, yeah, we'll do that. And we're going to do this other thing called service design. Well, we don't know what that is, but will you do the marketing? Yeah, we'll do that. And so we'd kind of sneak it in. And I find the same thing. Speculative design is kind of in that moment now, where we don't really take on speculative design projects, but there's an innovation project or there's a research project, and we build into the activities a speculative moment. So I think that's a good way to do it is find what the particular problem is and then build in these new ways of looking, these new frames with activities or exercises or pieces of research or work that kind of can add that to the conversation. So I think it's you sneak in a lot of things to start.
You're the researcher, you get the big finish, right? I get quite angry about this and get quite aggressive because I just cannot understand how any organisation could try and solve something without understanding what the problem really is and the background to it. And for me, design is often a risk management process, and you have to frame it like that to organisations. Say, why would you be so stupid as to go agile and spend lots of money on development without any idea about what it is you're trying to do? Our students, when they work with Imperial or London Business School, they're all amazed at all these very bright MBA students who come in with a completely stupid idea and just ask the designers to make an app. What a waste of time and money. We've got to be forceful with people and say, you are stupid, you are walking into a car crash if you don't do the research. Be angry.
I mean, I suppose what I do is I run like a tiny studio. There are 7 of us, right? And people only come to us when they've got those problems. There's a reason I don't work at a big place, because I would be doing the wrong work. So, you know, I would say, like, you know, maybe your responsibility in a big, like a larger consulting setup is to seed things, is to, like, you know, lead people elsewhere. But, you know, in the nicest way in the world, capitalism is not going to solve these problems, and, like, the big four consulting firms are not going to help either. So what we need is alternatives. And I think, you know, maybe if what you want to do is that work, you should maybe leave.
I'll leave that unsaid. So I have a question here. I don't think someone at the back has had a chance to speak yet, so I'll quickly...
Hello, how are you? Thank you for the speeches. It was very lovely to hear you. So I wanted to ask about the socialization of, well, I don't know if this is the correct translation, but basically taking an idea and really, you know, pushing it to be adopted within an organization, or taking a proposal, or taking a design. In my experience, in Latin America, we have a big issue with companies just being focused on, you know, profit and loss, very tangible, very, you know, numerical advantages, and it's very difficult to introduce new language into their considerations, like the impact they have on people, you know, on things on the planet, things that, you know, almost seem, you know, again, logical. So do you have any advice for designers on how to, you know, be, because as consultants, you know, we only get to a certain point, and then, you know, they take the toy and they play with it, and they can put it in a shelf, they could do whatever they want with it. How can we extend our reach, or create, I don't know, mechanisms within our deliverables that can extend the reach even after we're gone from the organization?
I do have an answer to that, which is badges and stickers. Give people stickers to put on their laptops, right? And then every time they're in a meeting and they open it up, they're telling everybody else in the room the thing that is on your mind, right? And, like, everybody loves that. They're like, yeah, I look really edgy and cool. I've got stickers. And actually, maybe it's, like, channeling a different thing. You know, like... But I genuinely, like, in terms of language, if you want to change people's language, and this is, like, badges, stickers, posters, leave the words in the place. People look at them, and they will say them back to you. It's amazing. It totally works.
I haven't got any stickers, sorry. But I've got a Trojan horse. And actually, I'm still answering the last question at the same time as answering this one. I don't think you should leave. I think you should stay in the horse, but understand your role to advance different thinking into organisations. But the other thing I was going to say, which I think I've probably forgotten now, is, well, I think the build it thing is still very relevant, but you've got burning platforms, that's what I was going to say. Most success I've always had is when I've persuaded people that they're in big trouble. And they usually are, actually, but they're just in denial. So, and I've worked at terrible places, big tech, banks, that was my Trojan horse to try and change. But to establish a burning platform, to find where the burning platform is. You know, in the bank I worked for, it was that everyone was complaining about the bank. And then I had the belief, the optimism in design to show that I could solve things that other people had spent almost decades not solving. And so I was in my Trojan horse, and I found a burning platform, and that allowed me to have a sustainable impact on that company. So you have to do this, again, you have to be at the party. The trouble is, I can understand why people want to leave, and lots of designers say get out of Twitter, get out of Facebook, people like Mike Montero. And we love him for that. But at the same time, once you've left, that's it. What are you going to do? Start your own version of Twitter? Trump tried that. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying I'm right, but I think you've got to you've got to engage with the world, and as Marshall McLuhan said, the solution is in the problem. So I think you have to engage with it to change it. That's the only thing I'd say. But find the burning platform would be my advice.
Just going to add that if you leave, sometimes people are scared of you, which is like
if you can
helpful.
do something good about when you've left, yeah, okay, fair. Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, one other quick thought too. I've had experience working in healthcare institutions where all truth comes from peer-reviewed journals, and to have a designer come in and tell a world-class surgeon that actually you're doing your practice wrong, that's really a hard thing to do. But we had a lot of success in some of the areas I'm with when validation comes from a single champion. So if you can find that one surgeon that gets experience with or has another sense of the vision, that person then can speak the language of everyone else, and they can kind of open doors and move things forward. The other thing is we've had validation. McKinsey did that amazing design study on sort of the value of design. When I was working in the States, the design council's work on what design thinking was, I mean, that was external validation for what we were saying, and that changed decision makers' minds on the type of work that's being done. It is a tricky one, but those types of champions, external validation, individuals that can speak the language, I think are all things that can start moving in the right direction.
One quick thing around language in particular, where we're looking at regenerative design. Like, I know historically we've tried to look at ways we can monetize design and measure it. We talk about when it's employee experience, you might look at retention rates or the cost of finding new employees, and it's very much still financially oriented. I find there's definitely a need for sometimes changing mindset. When you talk about sort of regenerative systems, sometimes you just get people to think differently about growth. And the way that language and mindset are linked, sometimes language isn't quite there. And having models and diagrams and examples of changing that mindset can then be helpful for then having different types of conversations. From that gesture, was that one last question, Dan? Okay.
Just quickly, can I quickly build on that? That I think we are in a much better position than we think. I think people are seeing burning platforms. They are realising they've got to change, and they are coming to people called service designers to try and work that out. Yeah. So I think we can be braver, and the door is more oiled than we might fear.
Well, and I'd add, if you can change anything, change the KPIs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. That's the magic. And because if what you're being asked to do is designed to a harmful outcome, no matter how great your work is, you're not going to change the outcome. If you can demonstrate a better outcome is achievable, then that's the thing that ultimately make the shareholders listen, I think.
I mean, if studying psychology taught me one thing, knowing that people can be very goal-oriented and incentivize them in the right way, they will solve amazing problems. One last question?
Yep. So when clearly predicted what you folks were going to say, he said the Design Council has released a design value framework, which has 4 pillars: socio-cultural, environmental, democratic, and financial. Often financial is the one that's always focused on. So how do we go about raising the other 3 pillars?
All the really small, simple questions.
I could go right. I don't think they're right, actually. So what I would say is to go back to changing the frame. Can we not make it about the care, right? The most important thing is, who are you looking after and who are you not looking after, right? It's not, do I have more money in my pocket now, right? It's kind of, what is the pro and con? And I think that we're, back to the slide I had with all the things up, right? It's not that life is in verticals. Life is a mess, right? And I think we're only going to get to better outcomes if we understand that it's a mess, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to try and answer that. The only thing I feel, and it is perhaps just a feeling, is that those things are becoming so interconnected and that in my lovely little optimistic bubble, I work with people who see they are becoming more interconnected. It's not saying everybody does, but you know, there have been, even in working in big bad organisations, I'm amazed at how right through an organisation people do care about their own employees. They do care about the quality of life of the people they're trying to sell their product to. They do realise they need people to afford and be doing well in life. And I think that there is a big shift going on. So to have a framework that quantifies that, changes the KPIs, has to be a good direction. We can always criticise it and say it could be better, but I think it's a good thing, and I think we will find that people will understand it. I bet over the next 5-10 years, things will really change on how we measure everything from GDP to the value of what we bring, because we're going to have to, for all the reasons that you've been hearing tonight. So I'm perhaps stupidly optimistic that people will get it, and there has been a massive transition in the last couple of decades around areas like sustainability and equity, not just equality. A lot has happened even in the last 5 years, and COVID has sped it up. So I'm going to stick to my optimism and say that we're moving in the right direction. We just got to work for cool people, not the bad people, and show what good looks like.
Yeah, I think. I mean, going back to Will, you kind of mentioned on language, when we identify these things, then they are a thing, and we can begin to have conversations about them and move towards them. I mean, even the chart now that is a little out of fashion, as you showed, the feasibility, viability, desirability, and that frame sold billions of dollars of design work and transformed a lot of companies because no one was talking about desirability until it was identified. So I also agree. I love the design council's work in that direction. I think it's a little reductive in my way that it needs to consider everything, and it's much larger and more complex. But as soon as we have a framework that identifies those elements, we no longer can ignore them, and they now exist to be discussed and addressed. So I think there's a lot of power in those types of identifications of elements and moving towards them.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. It's been a really interesting conversation. We're going to have a bit of a break in a bit, so you'll get a chance to ask questions still. We get a round of applause for our speakers this evening. And then just to wrap up, I'd like to hand over to Chiara, who is our Chief Design Officer for Europe.
Thanks, Will. Have to say that I came to London this morning. I'm based in Milan. I wasn't aware that there was this event planned. I know about Pi People, but I wasn't aware that it was tonight. So first of all, I want to really thank Will and the studio for having me during this event, but also for hosting those events. Because I believe that the thoughts, the perspectives that we heard today are the things that are necessary for us to continuously evolve the way in which we look at the problems that we are put in front of, the way in which we look at problems, the way in which we think about the human potential that we can empower through the acts that we do, and at the end, influencing what is the future that we are creating. So we spoke a lot about service design was just born. Design, the way in which we design, how we design is always in beta, because the world that we design for is changing, the context, the tools, the people that we need to interact is always different. So keeping a mind that is open and always reconsidering the way in which we do things is a key priority. So I believe that this kind of moment in which we interact with people that are different or are looking at things in a different perspective are enabling us to be better. So personally, I take some of the provocations that we had today and some of the weight, the feel of responsibility that we have as designer as a way to keep reconsidering personally and as Frog, the way in which we think about what quality means in the work that we do. Quality on one side about the craft, the way in which those artifacts are then reaching the world and how people are experiencing them, but also quality in terms of the impact that we want to achieve on people, business, and the planet more broadly. So thanks for carrying on those conversations, Will.
And then just to wrap things up, one final message from my current and previous boss, Pyle, who heads up IS&D.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Well, I'm here to just wrap this up to say, there's some food and drink after, but to also say we're just really glad to be back in person as Frog. Just really, really glad to be having these conversations. Chiara and I have been exchanging notes about just the richness of a conversation like this and what it really means to us. We don't get our heads out of the water very often. We don't really step away from the things that keep us awake at night, which is usually client work. To really start thinking about, why do we do this? Why do we get out of bed every morning? What does it really mean for what we want to do in 10 years from now? What's the next job I want to have? Those are the conversations that we genuinely believe we should be having as Frog, and we should be having across every possible community here in London, so that our impact on the world is a lot richer. And for some reason, we can sleep better at night, knowing well that we're doing meaningful things with ourselves and for the world around us. So this is a continuation of lots of conversations we've been having for years now, but in its new form, one we will continue to have as Frog. So we'll have this more often. Please come see us. If you're online, I don't know where you are, I don't know where the camera is, but please, please do keep dialing in. We really want to create a big, rich community of people around us who make us think differently, make us do things differently, and really make us feel like we've got still lots to learn. So thank you so much. You've got those cards. I've been told to tell you to look at those cards before you leave. There's a little board on the right-hand side before you leave. In order to build this community, we really need to try and understand, what do you expect from these conversations? And of course, if you want to come work with us, you know where to find us. Thank you so much.